So let me begin by saying what an enormous pleasure it is to be back in Lausanne and at a Nestlé meeting. And it is still relatively novel to do things in 3 dimensions, so it's very nice to do this. What Petra's asked me to do is to give a talk looking at some of the big pictures around the global food system and some of the challenges ahead. And in doing that, I'm painfully aware of the wonderful expertise in the room, and that many of the things that I will talk about very briefly, there are people here who have a lifetime of expertise in it. So please do forgive me when I go through your topic quite quickly and things. But I want to try and give an overview, at least what I think are some of the challenges ahead. And the talk is going to be in 2 parts. The first third, I am going to talk about some of the challenges, which I think we're aware of, but some of them are sort of new and evolving. But I want to spend more time on what I think we can do about it, because I'm an optimist. Even with all the challenges that are facing the world at the moment, I do think we can feed a population of 9 to 10 billion this century, maybe plateauing at 10.5, healthily, sustainably, and equitably, but only if we have the political resolve and wish to do that. Petra mentioned I'm a population biologist, and so I'd like to start off by talking about future population growth. And I like to tell my students, and I tell them really genuinely, that in my early 60s, I'm more optimistic about the future of the planet and the environment than I was when I was their age. And the reason for that is that 35 years ago, 40 years ago, I do not think that there was an intellectual argument against the Malthusian paradigm that eventually population growth will exceed our ability to feed the population. But certainly the most extraordinary thing that's happened in my adult intellectual life is that we know if we do the right things, if we bring people out of poverty, if we educate children, especially girls, if we provide access to reproductive health care, then human fertility, human fecundity naturally reduces. So we can talk now of a time when the demands the human race puts on the planet to produce food will level off and even go down. And to put it in a slang term, to me, that really is game on. You know, we can really plan for a time where we can cease to hurt the planet. The graph you see in front of you was the projection of populations. The UN Population Division, part of the UN, updates this every few years. And the latest revision came out a few weeks ago, and I'm afraid I just haven't had time to redo the slide. But I have put on the left a couple of the updated projections from the UN. And this is that by the end of this century, the population of the globe will be 10.4 million. But I want to sort of point you to the data on the fertility belowhand. So as recently as 1950, the average woman on Earth had 5 children. Today, the average woman on Earth has 2.3 children. And by the middle of this century, 2.1 children. That will be essentially replacement. Now, you'll see that population continues to increase this century. But the reason for that is most people are living longer, which is just a good news. So we do worry about population. I think people are alarmed and don't want to talk about population because there has been a history of coercive population control. But I would like to argue that population is an extraordinarily good news and that we should talk more about it. And we should concentrate on those pockets around the globe where for various reasons, especially things like educating children, population growth is still continuing at unsustainable ways. Now, when one talks about future consumption, there are 2 aspects to it. One is the number of people, and the other is per capita consumption. And whereas most of future population growth is going to be in the global south, It is in the global north that we have some of the issues around consumption. As people come out of poverty, which is obviously a good thing and leads to reduction in fecundity, what also happens is quite naturally they demand a richer diet. And here's some data on meat consumption across different countries plotted against GDP per person. And so although we're going to see the number of people coming to an asymptote, coming to a plateau, we are likely to see the amount of consumption continuing, at least for some time in the future. And for me, the consumption, especially in the rich world, and I do emphasize that the big issue of consumption is in the global north, in the rich world. That is one of the things that we really have to confront over the next couple of decades. So that's the demand side. What about the supply side? Well, again, I don't have to tell anyone that food production could be severely affected by global heating. And this year, I think it has really entered into the public consciousness in a way that it's not happened beforehand. That climate change is becoming a lived experience rather than something that's theoretical. Droughts throughout most of Europe. The really big heat wave in India at the beginning of the year. I don't know if you looked at the news this morning, but literally a third of Pakistan is underwater, which is going to have major effects on food production there for the next year. It is inescapable that climate change is going to affect our ability to produce food into the future. And of course, not only will climate change affect food, but the way we produce food is a major contributor to climate change. Now, I just want to reference a study a couple of years ago by a group led by Michael Clarke at Oxford that asked a thought experiment. And the thought experiment was this. Let us suppose that we have decarbonized every component of societies except food. So we've decarbonized heating, we've decarbonized transport, we've decarbonized cement production and things like that. So it's only food that is left. And let's suppose that we continue producing food business as usual into the future. Then what the calculation shows is that the food system alone, the emissions from the food system alone, is sufficient to push global temperature rises almost certainly above 1.5 and likely above 2. So I think the conclusion from this is that if we are serious about climate change, if we do want to do something about climate change, then we'll need to do something about food, and we will need to do something really quite radical about food. I'm now moving into your world a little bit. And in addition to the environmental consequences of food, we have the effect of food on health and well-being. And of course, there is good news here as well. The Millennium Development Goals that were set in 1990 and ran to 2015, and the one Millennium Development Goal that was actually met, and that's the graph on the left, was halving the fraction of malnourishment in middle and low income countries. Now, admittedly, a lot of that was done by the economic miracle that is China, but it does show that we can make serious progress against reducing the harms of underconsumption. A worrying thing is the number of people in acute hunger. And the graph on the right is data from the World Food Programme, updated for this year, and I put it in red because I'm not completely certain the scales are the same, but it's roughly the same. And we have seen an enormous uptick in those suffering acute hunger this year. And this is an interesting question because the majority of people, not all, of people suffering acute hunger are because they live in areas of conflict, both civil conflict and international conflict. And this is an interesting question, and one we might want to talk about during the meeting, is the degree to which some of these issues are within the food system or have to be solved from without the food system. But nevertheless, and I'll talk a little bit about food prices later on, the fact that the World Food Programme has now confronting double the amounts of hunger that it did last year at a time where supplies of food are difficult to get is worrying. So those are under consumption. And then we have the issues of overconsumption. And this is just data from the UK, the proportion of people overweight. This is where I suck in my belly a bit to talk about this slide. And then the proportion of people who are obese. And you can see that the proportion of obesity, there's probably some good news with overweight, that it may be coming to a plateau, but the proportion of people obese are just increasing. And I was talking to Nina Modi last night, who these data only go up to 2018, and she was telling me of the really quite frightening uptick in the statistics around childhood obesity over the pandemic. A lot of children, for various complicated reasons, which I understand, according to Nina, are not fully understood at the moment, a lot of children have put on a lot of weight. And then and I'm going to come back to this at the end, and then we have the political situation at the moment. This is the FAO Food Price Index, which they started constructing in 1990. The difference between real and nominal is whether you deflate by American inflation. At the moment, it actually doesn't make much difference. And in fact, if you push that curve back before 1990, then food prices have been roughly stable, going down since the oil price volatility of the 1970s. And then we saw another period of volatility during the financial crisis in 2008 and 2010. Food prices came down. And then they rocketed up after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia earlier this year. Now, you can't quite see it on this graph, but they have come down a bit. This is up to July. And they are now back to what they were in 2008. But it's still very unclear, and I'll talk a little bit more about this right at the end, about what's going to happen with food prices over the next year or so. So that's my sort of quick canter through what I think some of the challenges are, both the good news and the bad news going ahead if one's thinking about the global food system. And just to try and summarize that, we're going to see continuing demand growth, most of it through increased per capita consumption, some through increased population. Various people, including our group at Oxford, have tried to estimate it, but likely, and it depends the assumptions you make about changes in diet, we're going to have to produce 30 to 50% more food in different ways by the middle of the century. Some people argue a bit more, some people argue a bit less. The environmental impact of food production cannot be ignored. Increasingly, I believe it will become a political imperative to do something about climate change. And the food system will not be able to avoid that. And those parts of the food system, both the public and the private sector, who try and hide away from the imperative to do something about food system, are going to find themselves on the wrong side of history. We're going to see the diseases of overconsumption becoming of increasing importance. And we live in a more variable world. We're going to see climate change increasingly affecting production and other things. And it's not going to be the secular change in temperatures and precipitation. It's going to be the extreme events, the droughts, the floods, etc., that we're going to see. We're living in a geopolitically much more fragile world than even 2 years ago. What's happened in Eastern Europe, what might happen in Southeast Asia makes that clear. And then again, we've gone through the pandemic, a pandemic that I think a lot of us never thought we'd see in our lifetime. In fact, I suspect quite a few of you, like me, would like to start rerunning the 2020s again from the start. And there are many other viruses out there, many other diseases out there that might transfer into humans. We just don't know. We may be lucky. We may not see something like COVID, at least in our lifetimes. But we could see one next month. So one has to bear that in mind. So that's the challenges. And what can we do about it? Well, to me, there are two ways of looking about what we can do to make a healthy, sustainable, and equitable food system. One is to say, this is so extraordinarily complicated that there's nothing really we can do. You know, if you do this, if you do something here, then the non-linearities in the system will mean that any good you do there will be negated by something happening else. And so you can argue yourself into a mindset of despair just by thinking how complex things are. To me, there's another way of looking at it. Yes, it is true that the challenges ahead are enormous. And because they're so enormous, it makes the response actually really quite simple. And the simple response is that we have to try everything. We have to try to modify diets. We have to try to sustainably increase production. We have to try to reduce waste. And we need to improve food governance. And I think we just have to do all of these things. I have little time for people who say, no, we don't need to invest in agricultural research. We can do all the heavy lifting by diet change. I have little time for people who say, we waste 30% of food. If we reduce that to zero, then we don't need to worry about diet change. We don't need to worry about increasing agricultural land. We do not have the luxury of picking and choosing what we can do. We just need action on all fronts. And what I'm going to do in the remaining 20 minutes or so is sketch in appalling brevity some of the issues around both of those four different approaches. And I should say, you could cut this in a different way. I find it helpful to think about it in terms of these four different components here. So what should we do about diets? Well, I'm going to concentrate on one thing at the moment. What that histogram, that bar, shows you there is the contribution of the production of different food types to greenhouse gas emissions. The yellow component is staple crops. The red component is animal products. So it is inescapable. It is an inescapable truth that livestock production is one of the greatest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. I would argue that if you are serious about getting to net zero, then one has to have politically difficult conversations about livestock production and consumption. It is interesting that there is often a correlation between foods that have a big footprint on the environment and that are poor for your health. And this is a study that came out a few years ago by Mike Clark, again at Oxford, looking at, this is a spider diagram, and it's looking at the consequences, the health and the environment consequences of different food types. So on the left, you have various health consequences, and on the right, you have various environmental consequences. And top left, you see unprocessed red meat. That is something that, if you reduce consumption of unprocessed red meat, then you have both environmental and health benefits. If you increase the consumption of vegetables, then you have a good effect on your health and a relatively little effect on the environment. It's not always the case that it works well. The production of nuts, so almonds, for example, as a substitute for dairy milk, then almonds, especially in water production, is extremely heavy. And sugar-sweetened beverages. My friend and colleague at Oxford, Susan Jebb, says consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages is the most environmentally friendly way to ruin your health. So, but largely, there is a correlation between the two. Now, when I talk about having to have complex politically uncomfortable discussions. This includes things such as fiscal measures, such as taxation. And this, again, is of the order of a thought experiment about what one might do if one brought in a tax on food that was proportional to greenhouse gas emissions. And again, I don't want to make any pretense that this is a real economic exercise. This is a thought experiment. This shows the space within which policy could operate. And this study, led by Marcos Springman, brought in a greenhouse gas tax. It sort of left out low-income countries, where, again, the very last thing you want to do is to interfere with people's nutrition when it is being challenged at the moment. And when you do that, you get changes of price of the order of the blue histograms above the line, and changes in consumption given by the red histogram below the line. Now, the net consequence of doing this, and I won't go through all the caveats and things, this really is a rough calculation, but the net consequences is that were you to bring in this greenhouse gas tax, then you would have a reductions of emissions of 1 gigaton. And just to sort of anchor that, because I don't know what 1 gigaton consequence is, it is about 10% of the reduction that is required to keep the world below 2 degrees centigrade. So that is not something to be sniffed at. That is a really useful contribution to stopping the planet frying. And in addition, you get 500,000 avoided deaths because of better diets. So again, let me repeat, I'm not pretending that this is a policy thing that could be brought in, but I think what this does show is that there is a substantial space there to do good things if one had the political consensus, certainly among the politicians, but also we as citizens allowing politicians to make these hard decisions. This was a rather nice graphic that was in The Economist a couple of months ago. And on the left, you can see the production of maize, rice, and wheat, the three major grains. And you can see that the majority of rice and wheat, the big blue streams, go into human food. But look at maize. We eat a little bit amount of maize, but the majority of maize we produce goes into animal feed, and a big chunk of it also goes into biofuels. So again, if one is looking at resilience among the global food system, to feed that extra 1 billion people that we'll expect this century, in order to match the 30 to 50% increase in food demand, then that is one area, the redirection of cropland away from feeding animals into feeding humans is there is considerable capacity to there. And it's essentially thermodynamics. So it is much more efficient to eat plants than it is to eat animals that eats plants. And I've put this final slide up on the changing diets. And we could talk about this a long time, and I'm just going to sketch it. But I think we need to have a much better discussion about the roles of different actors. Now, in one sense, there is a duty on all actors to do things, consumers, civil society, private sector, government, etc. But I think we have to be realistic about the capacity. So my government in the UK and many other governments, when confronted with issues such as obesity, find it far easier to say, well, what we need to do is we need to empower the consumer to make better decisions. We need better labelling, we need education. And all of that is good. But much research, including by people in this room, will tell you that it does good, but it is not going to give you the change at scale that is required to transform the global food system. So there's nothing wrong with consumer-focused interventions, but don't pretend that the consumer can do the heavy lifting. The private sector, speaking here in Nestlé's building, the private sector has an enormous and really important role to make, but the private sector is a private sector. Paul, you have a bottom line. You are a private sector company. I think one of the greatest roles that the private sector can have is to empower politicians to make changes that will provide a level playing field, that will provide a regulatory framework that will be in place for a sufficient period of time that you can justify the investment in your investment in greater sustainability to your shareholders. And I worry sometimes when the reaction of the private sector to arguments for we have to do things is to circle the wagons and say, no, we shouldn't, we should do nothing, we should keep things away. I think if the private sector can get ahead of the curve and it can actually help fashion what are going to be the regulatory environment that is going to produce these better outcomes, both environmentally and health-wise, then that is going to be very, very helpful. I'd also say with civil society, so civil society, NGOs do a wonderful job in raising issues both on health and the environment. I think some of the challenges for NGOs are as great as the challenges for the private sector. Can we really, so if you're an environmental NGO, many environmental NGOs, nuclear power is just absolutely the devil. Avoid at all costs. Now, I'm not specifically arguing for nuclear power, but I am arguing that NGOs need to be challenged to think the unthinkable, to think about whether arguments against nuclear power, arguments about GMOs, whether they really have the luxury of being as pure as that. And then finally, with governments, we need governments to be braver and to be more willing to act. And I think there are two components of that. One is we need individual politicians to be braver and more willing to act. And then we as individuals, just as citizens of our different countries, we need to provide the enabling argument, the enabling environment for politicians to work. Now, I don't normally quote Jean-Claude Juncker. In post-Brexit Britain, we're not allowed to by law, you understand. But Juncker said something I thought was really sensible, and he said, often, we know what we need to do. What we don't know is how to get re-elected once we've done it. And we need to be able to convince the politicians that if they do the right thing, we will elect them. So I'm going to move now from modifying diets to sustainably increasing production. And I'm going to skip over this and sort of give some highlights and things. And I know the next speaker is David Stern from the Boyce Institute, so he will talk about this in more detail. But I do like the top pair of graphs here. That's a Bruegel on the left, which shows how high wheat was in the Bruegel. What would that be? 16th century. And that's a modern wheat field on the right. The wheat we grow today is much, much smaller. That's part of the green revolution. So we need to continue the green revolution. My colleague in the UK at Imperial College, Gordon Conway, says we need a double green revolution. So we need to increase yields, not only in the classic crops of the green revolution, but also the other crops, the more orphan crops. And then we need the other component of green, the sustainability in. My background is in entomology and pest management. I'm really optimistic about some of the new technologies coming through for pest management. That will, which I think will be more targeted and will lead to us not having to spray large parts of the countryside with poisonous small molecules. Now, I'm someone who believes that GMOs and modern biotech has a role as part of our armory. I fully understand that this is a decision that should be made by the people, and if the people decide not to do it, then so be it. But we should be aware that we are throwing away a really important tool, and I think David will say more about it. On the left is orange flesh sweet potato, which is an example of breeding using traditional methods that has produced a crop that has had a major impact on nutrition in Africa. So I think this genetic intensification has a really important component in introducing, in increasing production sustainably. And then we have, if you go into if you sit in a modern tractor in Europe or North America these days, it's a bit like being on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. Huge amounts of information there. There is an extraordinary amount that can be done by modern information technology. And this really is a win-win because it, especially the suite of techniques around the notion of precision agriculture, by reducing the inputs going into the farm, it saves the farmer money, and it's obviously of great benefit for the environment. It is extraordinary some of the things that can be done with livestock. I should perhaps have made it clear when I was talking about the need to reduce meat consumption. Some people will become vegans and some people will become vegetarians. I need to be very clear, I'm not a vegan or a vegetarian, but I am a flexitarian. I try and reduce the amount of meat. And there will always be a role, I think, for some meat production, especially in a country like Switzerland, where the silvopastoral system in the mountains is required to keep the environment in the state it is. But these are some examples of a modern robotic milking parlour, which is quite extraordinary. I'm sure that many of you have gone through it. I'm going to say something not very scientific, but when you go round them, you do feel the cows are very happy. And I'll defend myself slightly to saying, if you then look at the corticosteroids, if I've got the hormones right, that tends to back it up as well. And I love the slide on the left there of an automatic back scratcher, which the cows queue up to use. I showed that slide to my cat, who's put in an order for one. And of course, there are wonderful things happening in lower income countries with appropriate technology as well. And I'm sure we'll hear some of this from Agnes Calabata later in the morning, whose organisation has done a huge amount in this. I used to work in Kenya and could get a better mobile phone signal in the middle of nowhere in Kenya than I could just south of Oxford. And the ability for farmers to get information, useful information via their mobile phones to increase their production is really amazing. And for example, the top right is an example of microdosing. So microdosing is a very simple thing. Take a fertilizer, fill the top of a Coke bottle with fertilizer and put it at the base of your maize plant. And that really simple bit of advice has a really major effect on yields. And again, one of the great things about molecular biology becoming applicable to more than just a relatively few number of crops is that one can then take the power of science and try and improve crops such as millet and sorghum and cassava, which are just needed by so many people in the drier tropics. And because I'm running out of time, I'm going to skip over this, but there's also a lot of interest for meat substitutes and some of the ways that we will in time, I suspect, be able to produce, certainly in the short term, processed meat that is indistinguishable from real meat. And maybe in time, and I think there will need to be some scientific breakthrough, we'll be able to actually make real textured meat in the lab. And I just put this in as, I'm a biologist by background, I care deeply about biodiversity. There is sometimes a tension between people who care about the environment and people who worry about agricultural intensification. I believe in sustainable intensification, partly because we need to produce more food, but partly we need to have the space for nature as well. So to me, arguing for sustainable intensification is also an argument for biodiversity. Okay, I'm going to go through reduced waste really quite quickly, partly because it's just an obvious thing to do. There are some really interesting technologies coming through. The salmon on the left is in a package that automatically tells you when it is going off. We also have to be realistic about waste. So the packaging at the top is helps reduce waste, and yet packaging itself produces emissions. A lot of waste is economically rational, and I say economically rational, it mightn't be rational on the bigger picture, but it's going to be very hard to reduce. So we can do a lot on waste, but it is never going to be a get-out-of-jail card that is going to cause all the problems. So I skip over that quite quickly because I just want to finish on improving food governance. And we could talk about many things around food governance, and I'm just going to focus in on one particular issue here. This is a distribution of large global cities, cities above 500,000, and their growth rate. So the brighter colours are the cities that are growing. And you can see in China and Asia this huge number of new centres of urbanisation, which are growing, but not incredibly fast. But then look at sub-Saharan Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, you have a huge amount of urbanisation and very strong growth. So Kinshasa in the DRC, above 20 million people at the moment. I do not think that what is happening globally with urbanisation is as policymakers are quite as aware of it as they should be. So here's another graph as well. This is low-income countries, developing countries' cereal trade. Now, some low-income countries export grain, but the vast majority import grains. Those pictures I showed you of the global food system, then many of those of the cities, many of those big sub-Saharan Africa, most of them are on the coast. And the reason for it is that they are largely fed by global commodity markets. Now, in time, indigenous agriculture, I hope, will increase through the work of people like Agnes Calabatu and some of the people from Africa in the audience today. But for the foreseeable future, many of those big urban centres are going to have to be fed by global cereal trade. And when we see, this is a graph I've shown you before, when we see volatility in food prices like this, then this really worries me about the resilience of the system. There was some work done by a group in Boston University who looked at the correlation between food prices and civil instability during the period 2008-2010. So I'm going to blow up the bit of the graph just to the left of the word real. And then when you do that, you see, especially in the MENA region, but also elsewhere, a whole load of food riots. And what this says to me is that we really need to look at the resilience of the global food system to potential perturbations. And much of the global commodity trade, it's interesting, it's in the hands of a relatively small number of companies, the Cargills, the Bunge's and things, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But these are also private companies as well, so there is not as much transparency as if they were a publicly quoted company. And then many of the other things you would like to know, for example, Chinese grain stocks are a national secret. So I worry about lack of transparency, and I worry about the resilience of the food system. And I think we should be doing with the food system this type of stress testing that we now do regularly with the banking system, in sort of Basel III and things like that, and we wish we were doing that 20 years. Because if we get it wrong, then we're going to see horrible humanitarian catastrophes in parts of the global south. And so ethically it's the right thing to do, but even if you're being purely Eurocentric, then we're seeing some of the horrible disasters over migration, people dying in the Mediterranean. That would be as nothing as if we had some real problems in sub-Saharan Africa. And just to finish, I'll come back to where we are at the moment. And it's amazing how from if you were like me, my geography of Ukraine was pretty rudimentary 6 months ago, but I painfully now know where all the major towns are in Ukraine. And you'll recognize this graph. And the dark regions are the regions that produce most of the wheat. And again, you'll see Zaporizhia, Kherson, exactly where the fighting is at the moment. Now, we just don't know what is going to happen going ahead. We saw commodity prices rise very strongly after the invasion. It's interesting now that they have come back. Now, these are commodity prices. They're not food prices experienced by individuals, which sort of involve transport and are also affected by gas as well. So I just don't know what is going to happen going ahead. This is something that worries me. This is fertilizer prices. Fertilizer prices have been affected by the price of gas, which is required for some production, but also a lot of fertilizers come from Belarus and Russia. And those fertilizer prices are going to be challenging for farmers in high-income countries. They're going to be terrible for people in low-income countries who are struggling to pay for fertilizer at the moment. So it's very unclear what's going to happen in the next year or so. So let me conclude. Feeding 10 billion people sustainably, equitably, and healthily is a solvable challenge. I worry about the next 2 years. Do not fall victim to analysis paralysis. There's a lot all of us in our different spheres can do at the moment. And then I tend to finish a lecture on this. Now, it's sort of unnecessary for this audience, but if I'm talking to a general audience who aren't food experts, who care about biodiversity, who care about human rights, who care about whatever, then there is something special about food, and if we fail on food, we fail on everything. Thank you very much indeed.